Well, thank you everyone for coming to our very first ever AI and Humanity Seminar Speaker Workshops or series. Today we are very pleased to invite Dr. Dmitri Gallow. Now, Dr. Gallow has very broad and very deep expertise in a variety of fields, including metaphysics, epistemology, decision theory, ethics, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of language, and much else. And he's published in a number of different venues on a number of different topics. And one of his papers in 2021 actually won one of the top 10 best philosophy papers of that year. And if you're interested, it's called a Model Invariant Theory of Causation. Most impressively, he was recently a fellow at the very prestigious Center for AI Safety, where he worked on a highly anticipated paper that he will be presenting today. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Dmitri Gallow.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for coming. So I think we're at a really significant moment in human history right now. I think this year we created, for the first time, an artificial general intelligence. I think it's controversial whether we've done it, but in my view, it happened this year. And I think maybe less controversially, it'll happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think a lot of people are kind of wondering, well, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen once we have these artificial general intelligence? How are they going to transform society? How are they going to transform the world? And I can't tell you that. I'm just a philosopher. But I think what we philosophers can do is we can help us all collectively think a little bit better about what's going to happen next. And that's what I want to try to do today. So I'm going to be engaging with an argument that what happens next after we have artificial general intelligence is existential catastrophe, is basically the end of human life on this planet as we know it. So this is an argument that has been kind of increasingly influential at least in the American media. And it's given voice by two particular authors that I'm going to be talking about, Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky. So here is, awesome. So this is Eliezer Yudkowsky in an editorial that he wrote in Time magazine earlier this year. He said, "The most likely result of building a superhumanly smart AI under anything remotely like the current circumstances is that literally everyone on Earth will die. Not as in maybe, possibly, some remote chance, but as in that is the obvious thing that would happen." Nick Bostrom says something similar where he says the default outcome of the creation of machine superintelligence is existential catastrophe. So why do they think this? Well, they both have a kind of common argument for this conclusion. And that argument has two premises, what I'm going to call, following Bostrom, the orthogonality thesis, and what Bostrom calls the thesis of instrumental convergence. So let me go through those two premises. Do people know what orthogonality? Maybe because Americans don't know what orthogonality means, but it just means perpendicular. And so the orthogonality thesis is saying that when it comes to intelligence and when it comes to what you want, they are orthogonal to each other. There's no relationship whatsoever between how smart you are and what you want. You can be as smart as you like and still want nothing other than to dance the Macarena, nothing other than to emblazon the Nike symbol on the moon, nothing other than to calculate the decimal expansion of pi out to 1 billion digits. Just being smart doesn't mean you're necessarily going to want any particular thing. So this is how Bostrom puts it. He says, intelligence and final goals. So Bostrom's drawing a distinction between your final goals and the instrumental means that you take to those final goals. Intelligence and final goals are orthogonal. So more or less any level of intelligence could be combined in principle with more or less any final goal whatsoever. So that's the thesis of orthogonality. Yeah, and so Eliezer Yudkowsky has this nice metaphor for thinking about orthogonality, where he says, Imagine a map of mind design space. So all the possible minds that any kind of intelligent creature could have. It says in one corner, a tiny little circle contains all humans, within a larger tiny circle containing all biological life, and the rest of the huge map is the space of minds in general. And he thinks, look, when you create a mind, if you just know that there's some mind out there that's intelligent, that doesn't tell you very much about what it's going to be like. You can't expect that it's going to be anything like us. So he says this rules out anthropomorphization. You should think that, like, if you just create a mind ex nihilo without carefully planning it, it could end up wanting just about anything while still being quite smart. So here's a way of thinking about this. Let's imagine an agent. I'm going to call it a super intelligent agent, so I'll name her Sia. And what the orthogonality thesis tells us about Sia is that if you just bring Sia into existence and the only thing you know about her is that she's very intelligent, then you should think of her desires, her final goals, as being sampled more or less randomly from mind design space. It's sampled more or less randomly from the space of all the possible desires that a creature could have. So the thought is, if all you know about Sia is that she's very smart, then you shouldn't know very much about what she's going to want at the end of the day, what kind of desires she's going to have. So that's the first thesis. The first thesis is knowing that these things are smart doesn't tell you anything about what they're going to want. And the second thesis says that nonetheless, even if you don't know anything about what an artificial agent is going to want at the end of the day, you can know something about the means that they're going to take to achieving those ends. So this is, the second premise is called instrumental convergence. And Bostrom means that, like, well, the means that you're going to take to those ends are convergent. So he says, this is his official statement of the thesis of instrumental convergence. He says, several instrumental values can be identified which are convergent in the sense that their attainment would increase the chances of the agent's goals being realized for a wide range of final goals in a wide range of situations, implying that these instrumental values are likely to be pursued by a broad spectrum of situated intelligent agents. I just want to note that this is Bostrom's official statement of the thesis, and it contains within it an inference. So there's one claim up here about how having these, I should say what the instrumentally convergent means are. Bostrom just gives a laundry list, and it's things like resources, power, preservation of your own desires. So Sia won't want to change her desires, resources. So the idea is, firstly, having those, so the first part of the thesis is having those, power, resources, preserving your desires, that would be instrumentally valuable to have. And the second part of the thesis that Bostrom infers from it is that an intelligent agent is likely to pursue those things. And those are two very different kinds of statements. It would be instrumentally valuable for me to have trillions of dollars. I'm incredibly unlikely to pursue trillions of dollars, in part because I don't think I'm at all likely to succeed if I do it. And there are risks associated with pursuing it, and there are costs associated with pursuing it. So they're two very different kinds of claims. I want to note that it's the second part of the thesis that's relevant for the argument that we're considering. It's the idea is that Sia, this super intelligent agent, will likely pursue the instrumentally convergent means of power, resources, desire, preservation, and so on and so forth. So the thought is, whatever her final desires are, she's very likely to take the means of surviving, preserving her desires, acquiring resources, acquiring power, so on and so forth. So Bostrom says she's likely going to have a convergent instrumental reason to, in many situations, acquire an unlimited amount of physical resources and, if possible, eliminate potential threats. Human beings might constitute potential threats. They certainly constitute physical resources. And here Bostrom is echoing a saying, an aphorism from Yudkowsky that he repeats very often, which is, the AI does not hate you, nor does it love you. but you are made out of atoms which it can use for something else. So this is the thought. I think so these two premises together are supposed to get us that the default outcome of machine superintelligence is existential catastrophe. And the idea is what orthogonality tells you is that you're kind of sampling randomly from the space of all the possible minds. You're sampling randomly from all the possible desires that Sia could have. And then instrumental convergence tells you that like most of them lead to the annihilation of human. Most of them lead to Sia being incentivized to kill humans. So like maybe there's some desires you could find up here which are going to save you, but most of them are going to lead to existential catastrophe. So if you're sampling randomly, you should expect as the default outcome that that the AIs are going to take steps to disempower and eliminate humanity. Okay, so that's the argument. What I'm going to do is I want to think a little bit more carefully about this argument and whether it's correct. And the thing that I'm going to try to persuade you of is not that the conclusion is false. The conclusion might be true. But what I want to try to persuade you of is that this line of thinking is a little bit too quick and that we should slow down a little bit and think about it a bit more carefully. I'm going to say a little bit about the orthogonality thesis, but I'm mostly going to focus on the thesis of instrumental convergence. But let me say a little bit more about why I think the thesis of why the orthogonality thesis. Sorry, let me go back and say I think that the orthogonality thesis is a claim about the compatibility of sort of any level of intelligence with any kinds of desires whatsoever. But you might think, well, okay, but Sia's desires, Sia, the artificial intelligent agent that we are building in San Francisco, that thing is not going to have desires that are sampled randomly, and because we're going to build the thing, and we're just going to put whatever desires we want into Sia. And I just want to say something about why why you should think that whatever's going on inside Sia is something that we don't know that much about, and that we're not explicitly building these desires into her. And I think this is something that my erstwhile colleague Simon Goldstein says, is that really these artificial minds, these chatbots, they're not being built by us. They're really being grown. And the idea is, well, the way that they work is you set up this kind of neural net architecture, and you send it off playing this game, this guess the next word game. So it goes through the internet and it keeps guessing the next word. And if it guesses the word correctly, then you give it a little sweetie. And if it guesses the word incorrectly, then you slap it on the wrist. And then there's this back propagation algorithm where it adjusts all the weights in the neural net in response to the sweetie or the slap on the wrist. But you don't really have any idea what's going on in there. You've built the back propagation algorithm, but you don't understand how these weights are being set. And so insofar as there's a mind being grown inside this thing, it's not anything that any one person explicitly designed. And so you might think, well, look, it's being built on the guess the next word game. Who knows what kind of desires, if there are any desires at all, are going to emerge through that process. Let me push back against the thesis a little bit. You might think it's not clear that this thing that we're building through the back propagation and the guess the next word game is going to have any desires at all. There's lots of technology that we have that performs tasks for us. It performs it very well, but doesn't want to perform those tasks. It doesn't have desires. It's just not the kind of thing that has desires. You might think we're capable of building a machine that has an intellect, even though it doesn't have a will. And you might also think that, a machine that you built, or that you grew by having it play the guess the next word game is going to be particularly interested in producing speech or text, but not particularly interested in something else. You might think that AI agents are going to be more likely to desire the kinds of things that we built them to do than they are to desire other things. So I think those are kinds of two things to worry about when it comes to the relevance of the orthogonality thesis to the first premise of this argument. But I really want to put those kinds of concerns aside and focus much more on the thesis of instrumental convergence. So for the purposes of this argument, the thesis of instrumental convergence tells us if her desires are sampled randomly, then she's likely to pursue survival, desire preservation, resources, so on and so forth. I think this claim about instrumental rationality is the kind of thing that we can investigate mathematically using tools from decision theory. So go to the next slide. Yeah, so there's kind of a standard model in decision theory of how rational agents make choices. And the idea is you start off with some representation of their beliefs, which is given by a subjective probability function, and some representation of their desires, which is given with a subjective utility function. And then those two together are going to determine which choices are rational. And if you're interested, the way that it standardly works in decision theory is that, well, you sort of look at the expectation of the desirability of an act, where that expectation is taken with respect to your subjective probability function updated on the performance of that act in some way or other. But if you've seen that before, then I just wanted to help you see what's going on. But if it doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. What I want to do is, I think that we can sort of spread a probability distribution over all the possible desires that Sia could have. And we could have that probability distribution sort of build in as little information as possible about what it is that she's going to want. And then, using this formula, we can just take that probability and push it forward onto choices. And that'll tell us sort of, if instrumental convergence is true, then a probability distribution that tells us nothing about what she wants will end up telling us something very interesting about which choices she's likely to make. So I think that's just a mathematical question. We can just investigate whether or not that's true. And I think that when we do investigate whether it's true, I think we find that it's largely not true. So here's just a theorem that you can prove. If Sia's desires are sampled randomly, and I can get into more about what that means, but if they're sampled in a way that tells you very little about what it is that she's going to want, then basically you end up knowing very, very little about which choice she's going to make. So more precisely, it says if her desires are sampled randomly, then those desires are just as likely to make A more rational than B as they are to make B more rational than A. So I think when we look at this carefully and investigate the thesis, we see there's not a convergence of instrumental rationality. There's actually a radical divergence of instrumental rationality. Okay, so that's a kind of a very negative result about instrumental convergence. But I think there are some more positive things to say. I think there are ways in which instrumental rationality is going to bias Sia towards certain kinds of acts and against other kinds of acts. At least in the sense that if you know almost nothing about what her desires are going to be, you can say something that she's a little bit more likely to perform these kinds of acts and a little bit less likely to perform these other kinds of acts. So I said that the probability that B is more rational than A is going to be equal to the probability that A is more rational than B if her desires are sampled randomly. But it doesn't follow that A is just as likely as B to be the most rational overall. In fact, that's not true. So here's if we have, we don't know what Sia's expected utility is going to be because we don't know what her desires are. But if we spread our probability distribution over her desires in a certain way, then we get a probability distribution over what her expected utility for various acts is going to be. And what it will end up looking like is something like this, where, if the green line is our probability distribution for Sia's expected utility for the act A, and the blue line is our probability distribution for Sia's expected utility for the act B, and the orange line is our probability distribution over Sia's expected utility for the act C, it'll look something like this. Well, they'll have the same mean, but the variances will be wider for some choices than others. And so acts like C, this orange one here, that one is, because the variance is wider, it's more likely to be the most rational overall. It's also more likely to be the least rational. But just because the variance is so wide, it's more likely to end up at the top of her preference ordering than something like the blue line where it's all scrunched together. And so there's a kind of bias that is built into instrumental rationality. And the bias is this. She's more likely to make choices which lead to wide variances for our probability distribution over her expected utility. And the thing that controls the variance is how much that act leaves up to chance. So if the act leaves something, if it leaves more up to chance, then she's less likely to make the choice. If it leaves less up to chance, then she's more likely to make it. So a little bit more precisely, if you're interested, the variance of these things are controlled by the entropy of this updated probability function, your subjective probability function updated on the performance of the act. So that's a kind of bias. Does that bias help the argument for existential catastrophe? I think it's not entirely clear. So you might think, well, look, eliminating humans, the world is so simple if there are no humans. Humans are so unpredictable. They're so complicated. If Sia were to just get rid of humans, then everything would be very predictable. So it leaves very little up to chance if you just annihilate all humans. This is something that a lot of people said to me in San Francisco. But I think we really have to be careful here, because what Sia's desires don't just have to do with what happens in the future, but it also has to do with what could happen between now and then. And even if the world is more predictable once humans are gone, that doesn't mean that it's predictable how things would go between now and the annihilation of humans. You know, if Sia could have some complicated contingency plan in her head for how she's going to annihilate humans, and there could be lots of different branches depending upon how humans respond to various things, and it could be massively unpredictable how things are going to turn out. So it's not obvious to me that, you know, existential threats to humanity are more predictable or leave less up to chance. You might think that Sia's survival leaves less up to chance. You might think that, like, oh, so Sia's going to be incentivized to pursue her own survival. But again, it's not so clear to me. I think it's an open question to what extent her survival is going to lead less up to chance. I also think it's not clear that desire preservation in general is going to leave less up to chance. If Sia has a desire to just sit around calculating the decimal expansion of pi, then her future self is going to be very predictable. It'll be very clear, she's just going to sit there and calculate digits of pi. Whereas if she has some other more interesting desires, she might be less predictable. So retaining her own desires might leave more up to chance. Can we go to the next slide? There's another kind of desire, and it has to do with sequential decisions, where Sia is thinking, I have a long decision tree, and I'm going to make choices later on depending upon the choice. You know, I'm going to have different choices later on depending upon what choices I take now. So here's a kind of decision that Sia could face. She could either take A now and get A, or she could wait a little bit, and then tomorrow we'll offer her B. And then at that point, she could take B, or she could wait a little bit, and then the day after we'll offer her C. And she could take C, or she could wait a little bit, and then take D, and sort of on and on like that. So this is a kind of simple decision tree that Sia could face. And every sort of route through the tree corresponds to a different way things could be. So it's a different object of desire for Sia. And just if we think that she's just as likely to want to end up here as she is to want to end up here as she is to want to end up here, then she'll be just as likely to have a contingency plan that takes her immediately up as she is to have a contingency plan that takes her this way, as she is to have a contingency plan that takes her that way. And so every route through the tree is equally likely. But if we go back to this node of the tree and ask, well, how likely is it at this node that she goes up? And how likely is it that she goes right and waits? It's going to be way more likely that she waits, because it's way more likely she wants some outcome further down on the tree. So that's a kind of bias that's built into sequential decision making. And the bias is that Sia is likely to want to make choices that afford her more choices later on. Assuming that her desires are sampled completely randomly, we don't know anything about what she wants, we should think she's likely to make actions that are going to afford her more choices later on, as opposed to choices that aren't going to afford her more choices later on. So you might think, okay, well, that shows us that she's going to want to pursue her own survival. Because after all, the best way to have more choices to make later on is to survive long enough to make those choices. I think it's not totally clear. And I think, in part, it's important to recognize that nothing, she's more likely to make this choice at this stage, but nothing about this depended upon her surviving at every point throughout this tree. So it could be that, like, suppose that this is just Russian roulette, and she could either, like, opt out of Russian roulette now or play it one day. And then at that point, she could either opt out of Russian roulette or play it again the next day. At that point, she could either opt out of Russian roulette or play it again the next day. Well, then at stage one, she's going to be very likely to play Russian roulette. So very likely to take an act that endangers her own life. So I think the connection between wanting to make choices that afford you more choices later on and pursuing your own survival is pretty complicated. Okay, there's a final bias that I want to talk about. And that is that, sort of in line with Bostrom's conjecture, I think there is a bias towards preserving your own desires. And just to kind of to understand what's going on here, Sia is going to start off at this decision node, and she's going to have a choice to either go left or right. If she goes right, she's going to keep her desires, and then she'll face a choice between A and B. If she goes right, then she's going to change her desires, and with those changed desires, she will make a choice between A and B. So there are really kind of four possible outcomes to think about here. There's the possibility where she keeps her desires and ends up with A, keeps her desires and ends up with B, the possibility where she changes her desires and ends up with A, and changes her desires and ends up with B. And there's a bias here where she's going to be slightly more likely to want to go left than to want to go right. And the reason is that if she goes right, then these changed desires are going to be deciding between these two possible outcomes over here for her. So she's definitely going to go for A or definitely going to go for B. Whereas if she goes left, she's going to pick whichever of these she likes best. She's going to pick like the maximum desired option between these two. And that means that it's more likely that one of these outcomes is going to be preferred to the one outcome over here. So that's a kind of bias. Again, it's not clear how big this bias is, but there will be a bias towards preserving her own desires. That you might think is something to worry about because, we very often want to shut down machines that aren't working and change them, repair them. So it's a worry if you have an artificial agent and you think, oh, it ends up, perhaps it's like an artificial agent that you task with, growing your investments. And then it starts pursuing deviant strategies, like it starts like calling up and threatening the CEOs of companies that are in competition with your investments and doing things that you don't want it to do. And then you want to shut it down. Well, if Sia is incentivized to take steps to preserve her own desires, she might be incentivized to take steps to keep you from shutting her down and changing her desires. So that's the third bias, is that Sia is more likely to take choices which preserve her desires than she is to take choices which are going to lead to her desires changing. I want to note that all these biases are kind of interacting with each other in complicated ways. So in particular, you might think, well, if Sia has predictable desires, then those predictable, simple desires of her leave less up to chance. So at the same time as there's a bias in favor of desire preservation, there's also a bias in favor of desire change, insofar as desire change leaves less up to chance. And I don't have any kind of theoretical results about the relationship between these biases and how they interact. I think a lot's going to depend upon the particular choices that she faces. So I think what I think we've seen is that, first off, the kind of thesis of instrumental convergence is largely incorrect. Instrumental rationality does not converge on certain means, but it instead diverges. It if you know nothing at all about what Sia wants, you're going to know very little about how she's likely to behave. Nonetheless, there are three biases that we can identify. The first is that she's more likely to make a choice if it leaves less up to chance. The second is that she's more likely to make a choice if it affords her more choices later on. And the final bias is that she's more likely to take steps to preserve her desires than she is to take steps which lead to her desires changing. So going back to the kind of the argument that we considered at the beginning, I think that we have reasons to worry about a lot of the instrumentally convergent means that show up in the second premise. I think if her desires are just sampled completely randomly, we shouldn't think that she's more likely to pursue survival or resources or power. I do think we should think she's somewhat more likely, all else equal, to pursue the preservation of her own desires. And that's everything. So thanks so much. Thanks so much for listening.